Good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to see you here again for those who were yesterday in the first day of this international conference. And today I have the pleasure to have a very distinguished table to talk about green economy and financing for development. So I'll announce our speakers and then we will move from one after the other. We have our first speaker of today is Mario Pezzini, to be talking about his presentation will be Rethinking International Cooperation to Define New Development Models, Perspectives from Development in Transition. And Mario Pezzini is director of the OECD Development Center. Before joining the center, he has occupied several management positions at the OECD, where he has been working since 1995. And prior to that was professor for industrial economics at the École Nationale Supérieure des Mines of Paris, and as well in the US and Italian universities. He has been also an advisor of ILO, UNIDO, European Commission, and Oshima in Italy. I'll present all the speakers before. Next, we'll have the presentation from Stephany Griffith-Jones. She'll be talking about the role of European Investment Bank and National Development Banks in COVID times and for EU green transformation. Stephany Griffith-Jones is current Emeritus Fellow of the IDS, Financial Markets Director of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue at Columbia University, and Research Associate, ODI, London University. She has published enormous amounts of books and articles, more recently, The Future of National Development Banks with Ocampo, and also Time for a Visible Hand, Lessons from 2008 for Financial Crisis with Ocampo and Joseph Stiglitz, 2010. Our third speaker will be Paulo Esteves, who will be talking about financing development in the Anthropocene. And Paulo Esteves is professor of PUC-Rio. He's a member of the network as well, and he's former director of the BRICS Policy Center. He has published a series of articles and books in the areas of international development, emerging powers, and BRICS. His current research is on development cooperation, South-South cooperation, especially in regards to the SDGs, Paris Agreement, and financing for development. He has served as a consultant for UNDP, ECOSOC, UNDESA, and GDOC. And finally, we have our last speaker today, who will be Rogerio Studart. He'll be speaking about funding a just and sustainable future, a view from the South. Rogerio Studart is a senior fellow of the World Resources Institute. He was also an executive director for Brazil and Suriname in the International Development Bank Group, and had several positions in the United Nations in Santiago, Chile, in Geneva, and the Chase Manhattan Bank in Brazil. He has published also a lot of articles and books about macroeconomics, finance, development finance, and columns in different medias around the world. So I welcome you all here, and I think we can start. Each of the speakers will have 15 minutes. I'll let you know 3 minutes before your time is over. Thank you very much. So we can start. Mario Pezzini, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's for me a real pleasure to be with such a group of relevant thinkers and also policymakers. So I'm honored to be here. And in this respect, I tried to do the job that was assigned to me, given the importance of the audience, and to address the rethinking international cooperation to define new development models. In fact, the question that I am trying to address is why we should rethink international cooperation when we are addressing green economy and financing for development in general. I think there are 3 reasons that explain why a change has been produced in the world, and consequently, the ancient mechanisms we have do not work that well anymore. I will in particular stress that we have changed first the objectives, then the actors, and third, the modalities of development cooperation in a way that require now a transition to a kind of a new cooperation system. So let me start with the objective. Well, in traditional terms, I am going obviously to simplify, the objective of development cooperation was mainly reducing the amount of extreme poor. And the idea was relatively simple. We calculate how many people are below the poverty line. We identify the amount of money that is required. We look for donors that have to pay 0.7 of their GDP. And then we transfer these resources to the poor in the world. And as a consequence, when the poor will have left the poverty line, they will benefit from the market mechanism to stay permanently outside the poverty line. This type of logic did not function. Did not function despite a series of successes that actually in reality are also to be listed on the benefit of the appearance of the emerging countries such as China or India, that with their development contributed in home and outside to reduce extreme poverty. But the advantage that came directly from the international cooperation, and particularly the official one, were much more reduced. And the reason is therefore, what should we do instead? And the SDGs came exactly to try to figure out a different perspective. What is the inner or sometimes also the hidden assumption that there are behind the SDGs, we can guess. In any case, I think that we will all agree on the fact that they cover a wide range of objectives, not only extreme poverty, and in particular, they assume that there are different trajectories of development and consequently different bottlenecks to development in different countries that cannot be reduced only to the presence of extreme poor. In particular, I will try to assert that what is presented, what is happening in developing countries is actually the clear appearance or evidence of development traps that goes beyond the poverty trap, but include the poverty trap. Just to make some example of what I mean with this development trap, let me quote an institutional trap that exists in the countries from which many of us are coming. If we look, for example, at Latin America, we realize that this institutional trap is more or less the following. People consider the government as an actor that cannot be fully trusted. 5 years ago, only 55% of the population thought that you can trust the government. Today, the percentage are reversed. 55% of the people think that it is legitimate not to pay taxes. As a consequence, the government that have done some efforts to answer the request of the so-called new middle classes that come on the scene of the policy arena and ask for better services, well, they are confronted with the fact that this delegitimation will reduce further the fiscal revenue of government. And as a consequence, the capacity of government to respond is even more reduced. And we enter in a kind of cumulative process in which less and less the state are capable to react to the demand of people, including to put in place policies concerning the sustainable development and the global heating. Another example of traps that is a kind of cumulative process is represented by the social vulnerability. In countries where the type of industrial organization is mainly based on low quality jobs, the possibility for workers to improve the quality of their skills is extremely limited. We know these are processes that use universal machine with low level of tolerance, with high level of tolerance, with mainly on-the-job training, and as a consequence, the capacity to improve by working their productivity is reduced. I will also add a trap that is related to the dependence from natural resources, very often non-renewable. We know very well all the discussion that we have had about mining, the Dutch disease, but obviously this applies also to natural resources, in particular, natural resources that can be reproduced when it comes to activities that use high carbon growth path and also where the dependence from natural resources and external prices remain very high. So as a consequence, my first point, we have new objectives at present, and no more the objectives are not exactly the same objective than in the past, is that. My second point is that actors have changed. In the scene now, we find actors that in traditional development cooperation were not sitting at the table before. Let me just take an example here. One of the organisms that discuss about the characteristic of international cooperation, and if I want to be more precise, ODA, Official Development Assistance, I have to look at the Development Assistance Committee in the OECD, the so-called DAC. Who is sitting around the table? Well, only the rich country club. It was defined in 1961, and it changed very, very slowly, and actually it didn't change that much. Let me tell you that the DAC at present has 29 members. These 29 members exclude all Latin American countries, even when they are members of the OECD. They don't have any African country. And obviously, the major emerging donors, such as China, India, Indonesia, South Africa, or Brazil, are not presented in the DAC. Mexico either. So we have to deal with a very small table that issue the rule and the regulation for all contributors. Even with some efforts, this old table have added some associate countries, but when we go and look at who are the associate countries, we discover that they are Saudi Arabia, Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, and then you find also Azerbaijan that nobody has understood why it's there, but it's there, okay, fine. But the large majority of the countries we are mentioning are all pure donors. There is, in other terms, no capacity to recognize the enormous change that took place in the economy, and in particular in the geography of economy, where the body center of the economy moved, if we follow the calculation of the London School, from the Azores Islands 50 years ago, because it was North Atlantic, there was the locomotive of the world, to the eastern border of Turkey today. And this body center is still moving in direction of China and in part of the South. So the second point that I'm making is actors have changed, but the present mechanism of official development cooperation have not. My third point is about the modalities of international cooperation. When you consider that the main function is the transfer of resources from rich donors to poor and least developed countries that are supposed to have the highest concentration of poor people, which is not true, because they are the extreme poor, if we look in concentration, are no more in low-income countries. They are in middle-income countries, such as India, for example. When you think that your efforts is this transfer of resources, then fundamentally, the game is played by two actors, a donor and a recipient. And the game consists on exchange of financial resources where the dialogue is not that much required. Actually, you prefer maybe to have dialogue at the level of project implementation. But when it comes to the design of the entire policy, the design of the entire policy is done only between donors. And you don't even think that is required much more knowledge. Because at the end, you give money and you want accounting back. That needs to be the most clean, the most clear, and the most indicator-based possible. When you, on the opposite, consider that the bottleneck to development today are, of course, financial resources, but not only, that a lot has to deal with the policy capacity of developing countries, when you therefore realize that what you need to discuss around the table is also the type of policy that are best practices and also the implementation of those policies, then obviously the dialogue becomes indispensable. Little by little, we have seen in the development assistance cooperation, in fact, an evolution. And we have moved from bilateral cooperation more and more with experiments of so-called trilateral or tripartite or multilateral cooperation. Unfortunately, in many occasions, this trilateral cooperation is considered to be a funny innovation, something to show when you invite people at home, and therefore you show the better pieces of ceramic that you have. But there is another way to consider triangular cooperation. That is not the funny marginal innovation, but it's rather the laboratory for what should be a different type of international cooperation. Some that should be much more inclusive and involving and including not only the donors, but also the recipient, and of course, the new actors that have appeared on the global scene.
You have 3 minutes? Sorry.
Yes, thank you. So in order to summarize, I have said development cooperation is confronted with a new word. I am using the word of Mary Robinson that chaired an high-level panel on the DAC in 2017, and she practically concluded on similar terms. The world has changed, development cooperation has not. And therefore, we need to reconsider actors, objectives, and modalities, therefore the overall system. How can we move from the present system to something new? I have doubts that a change can be done radically in short terms. We all know that the bureaucracy are technostructure, and to pretend to move from one system to another, it will take time and will face resistance. We have several proposals on the table. Last but not least, Jonathan Glennie produced a book on the future of aid. And in the Development Center with CEPAL and many other actors, we are developing something that is called Development in Transition. And by the way, in the recent Ibero-American Summit, the president of the Ibero-American Summit approved a declaration on development in transition presented by the president of Chile, Uruguay, and Costa Rica. So there are movements around these matters, but how to make this change more than a dream? What I think that we should do is a kind of multilateral experimentalism. What we should do is to identify some issues on which we can create specific and tentative new agglomeration, new table. For me, what is going to be crucial is that around those tables, we need to have donors, but we need to include the new donors. Think to Africa and think to the way that China has in Africa in terms of partner, not only in trade terms, but also in terms of grants and loans. And on the basis of these experiments, see what can happen. In order to be more concrete, I will give just an example. And the example is, in the case of Africa, we desperately need to increase the volume of investment that at present is too low for Africa to recover, and therefore for the world to recover. And as a consequence, the African Union could call a table that will convene all the major partners of Africa together with some African countries. And this means that this table should see seats with China, United States, European Union, Turkey, and maybe some other, Japan, and maybe some other actors. This is just an example to say that we need to redefine the overall picture, and probably around that table, it will be much easier to discuss also the issue of debt, because in that case, we will discuss the debt, but also what you can do with the fiscal space that the reduction of debt could create. I don't know if I addressed fully the issue that was assigned to me, but I do think that rethinking the international cooperation today is crucial to define new development models and therefore to help the establishment of a more green economy and also better financing for development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we can move straight to Stephany and then we have the final Q&A.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm delighted to follow Mario Pezzini's excellent presentation and to address this important group of this nice project that we have. I'm going to be talking about the role of the European Investment Bank and development banks in general, both refer to COVID times, but particularly for the green EU transformation and the global. First, I would like to stress that we have had in recent decades a real renaissance of development banks. They were much maligned in the period of the so-called Washington Consensus, when private financial market efficiency implied, the wrong theory of that, implied that almost by definition public development banks had no role to play. But now they have been reborn. This started really with the so-called global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, when development banks at all levels, multilateral, regional, and national, stepped up significantly. The World Bank in its survey showed how, for example, national development banks, which is the most important category, increased their lending by 36% in 2 years, between 2007 and 2009. And similarly, the World Bank and the regional development banks also increased their lending because countries were desperate for funding, as in times of uncertainty, of course, private banks and other institutions don't lend or lend much less. This was followed by the Eurozone debt crisis, where again, the development banks stepped up and helped compensate for massive declines in private lending, and even more now in COVID. So this major counter-cyclical function of responding in times of uncertainty or crisis has given a lot of importance to development banks. There is a further impulse that comes from Asia, the creation, China-led, but more broadly Asian-led, of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and of the BRICS New Development Bank, of which Brazil is a member.
What I do when it's something like S2 method, I will do it the whole time that week.
Sorry, I think we need to mute Rogerio. Okay.
You're muted, Stephany.
Okay. So I was just talking about the New Development Bank, or the BRICS Bank, of which Brazil is a member. At the same time, there was increased importance given to the European Investment Bank through the Juncker Plan, and after the Eurozone crisis, also practically all European countries have now created national development banks, and they're growing in size. And interestingly, also in other regions, for example, very recently in Africa, Nigeria, and now most recently Ghana are creating development banks. In Asia, India, which had closed down a lot of development banks, is now creating one for infrastructure. Secondly, I would like to stress that these public development banks are already very important actors. If we add them all up, multilateral, regional, and national, and this has been estimated by the Agence Française de Développement, there are over $11 trillion of assets worldwide, and over $2.3 trillion of annual lending, which actually represents 10% of global investment. So they are already important actors. And in this broader context is where I want to talk about the role of the European Investment Bank in green transformation, though I will mention a little bit about the significant role it's playing in COVID, and particularly in health, because the EIB's actually funded the Pfizer vaccine, which some of you may have had or would like to have. And it would have probably not come to light or so quickly if the EIB hadn't stepped up with a particular loan. So the context for the green transformation And I should say that the presentation I'm going to do now draws on a paper of mine, which if somebody's interested, I've put the link in the chat box. So the broad context is the fact that the European Union took the lead by declaring that it would become carbon neutral by 2050, which has now been followed by other major countries, most recently the United States. But what is important to stress in this context is that this implies a major structural transformation across sectors in the EU economies and others worldwide in aspects like electromobility, renewable energy, including things like green hydrogen and the corresponding infrastructure to support them. This implies not just new projects, but also important research and development, what Mariana Mazzucato calls missions, which are cross-sectorial. And an additional challenge is that this transition has to be just. So we have to protect the poorest and the most vulnerable. So this major investment was first estimated by the European Commission to reach these targets by 2030, requiring an increased investment of at least 260 billion euros a year. But now, with more ambitious targets of reducing carbon emissions by 55% in 2030, requires even bigger amounts. And the European Investment Bank is central to this European Green Deal. And it has committed by 2025 that 50% of its lending will go to climate change related activities, both mitigation and adaptation. And furthermore, it has committed that by 2030, it will catalyze 1 trillion euros for investment in these areas. And also, I think very important is that all the operations of the EIB are under European Green Deal priorities. So it's not like with the 50%, they're going to do marvelous green stuff and then they're going to continue funding coal. In fact, they have stopped funding fossil fuels by the end of next year. And they have developed, I think what is interesting also from an international perspective and also of course for Latin America, they have developed pioneering instruments like the shadow price of carbon that Professor Aglietta was talking about yesterday. The EIB has introduced it over a decade ago and it has been really pioneering in that. And what I find very interesting is that already this year, the shadow price of carbon is 80 euros per ton of carbon, and it's going to shoot up to 800 euros by 2050, increasing gradually. So this is, I think, a very interesting concept and tool that would be interesting to discuss whether it would be relevant for regional and national development banks, say in Latin America. Secondly, there is an EU green taxonomy, which I think has been quite positive. It's not perfect, but it's positive. And EIB lending has to be aligned with that. And again, this kind of instrument of having a green taxonomy and using it for RDBs and NDBs would be very positive for, say, Latin America. There remains an important challenge, which is how to make the financial intermediaries through which the European Investment Bank and the European Investment Fund gives its resources, how to make these private financial intermediaries also align with Paris and with the green criteria. And I think this is an important next challenge. They have also designed an interesting climate roadmap to accelerate the green transition, to make it just, to make it accountable and make it Paris aligned. And this means not just lending to green activities, but also increase investment in innovative green technologies. And I think low carbon or green, as it's called, hydrogen, on which a lot of research is being done by the EIB and the private sector is very important. In its international dimension, because the EIB lends 10% of its activities are in developing countries, including Latin America. 35% of their lending since 2020, and increasingly so, will go to climate finance. So this is a very important element. Now, if we look a little bit very quickly at the sectors, they have made interesting progress. For example, the EIB has said that it will not lend to any further expansion of airports unless they have a very clear element. But they will not lend for expansion of conventionally fueled planes. They will only make loans for activities that mean greening airports. It's less good and a little bit more contested by the NGOs, the green NGOs, in that in certain regions and countries, they will still support road building if they meet certain tests. But perhaps they don't value enough where alternatives could be supported, like trains, which are, of course, powered mainly by electricity, or almost all. And the reason why they say that is that they will develop and support electric cars, electromobility, and therefore that they will be also green. But because we do not know, there is a lot of uncertainty about the speed of developing cars, there is some controversy on this. And I think the role that NGOs are playing in this, the green NGOs, is actually very constructive, because they put pressure on, they can put pressure on public development banks and on the EIB in particular, which they cannot really properly do with the private banks who don't even publish data. I mean, try and influence a hedge fund. If you look at their webpage, it doesn't have any information. So how can you influence them?
And you have 3 minutes.
Okay, I want to just very briefly say that it's very important if they use better instruments, because, for example, as a result of COVID, companies have increased their debt burden significantly because they're borrowing a lot and they have a lot of leverage. So for companies, it's very important to also have equity, public equity. Secondly, being involved in equity in companies allows institutions like the EIB to have more green directionality and to have more what we call traditionally industrial policy capacity, which I think is very important. And thirdly, if you have instruments of direct equity or quasi-equity, you don't just share the risks, but you also share the potential upside. So if, for example, you make a loan, like it's called venture debt, and the company does extremely well, the EIB has the right, in that case, to transform the debt into equity and therefore receive part of the profits. And as I mentioned at the beginning, a very successful example of this was the loan which they gave, 100 million euro loan, which they gave to BioNTech, who later associated with Pfizer, and has led to one of the major vaccines that exist, so I think it has a very strong element of public good, not only in the European context, but of course in an international context. So just to finish, institutions like the EIB need not just do better, greener, more inclusive, but they need to do more. The scale of the investment that is needed is so large that there is a requirement to have larger development banks. And I think this is very true also in many countries in Latin America, like Chile, that I have looked at closely, where they have good development banks, but they're very small. Or countries like Brazil, where you've had a very important development bank, but I think the scale has been reduced. So I think in those cases, it is important and cheap for governments to increase the paid-in capital. And in the case of in the European case, also for the European Commission to provide guarantees which imply that the EIB can take more economic risk and fund these new technologies and their dissemination. And I would like to, and I think this is a very important lesson also internationally. For example, I think it's very important that the capital of the World Bank is increased, the capital of the African Development Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank are also increased because the countries are in crisis, they have limited fiscal space, and they need the support, this counter-cyclical support, on a sufficient scale. And this is something where the international community has been silent. It's been good on liquidity, it's creating new SDRs, but it is not good in funding expanded development finance. And just to finish, I want to just also re-emphasize that there are potentially valuable lessons internationally from some of the pioneering aspects of the European Investment Bank, of course, duly adapted to the circumstances of Latin America, but the introduction, I think, of shadow carbon pricing, EU green taxonomy, climate roadmaps are interesting in providing experiences that can be drawn on also by Latin American and other countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephany. So we move now to Paulo Esteves, please. Paulo, you are muted.
Sorry about that. I hope you are seeing my screen. Just a sec.
Yes, the screen is there.
Okay, sorry, just a second. Okay, so what I'm gonna try to do is to reflect on a report.
Sorry, Paulo, do you want to make a full screen? Because it's on the side with the extra slides, just in case. Yes.
Yeah, I have a problem with my illiteracy with Zoom. If I share the entire screen, I'm not sure if you are seeing the full screen. Are you?
Now you stop it sharing. You can just share
sorry.
again.
Sorry about that.
We are all the same.
Yeah, sorry. Just a second. I'm gonna keep it small. Otherwise, I cannot see my notes. Sorry about my illiteracy in sharing this. Okay, so but it's basically two figures that I wanna show. So what I'm gonna do here is to reflect on the concept of Anthropocene under the light of a report that was issued last year in December. I'm not sure if anyone noticed, because we are still in the middle of the pandemic, but the UNDP issued a report on human development and in the Anthropocene. And I'm going to reflect on the concept of Anthropocene from the perspective of the report that was issued last year in December. So the concept of Anthropocene was first proposed, as everybody knows, in the early 2000s and has had since then an important impact on academic outputs and policymaking alike. According to Krutz, and I'm quoting him here, the Anthropocene is a new geological epoch in which mankind has emerged as a globally significant and potentially intelligent force capable of reshaping the face of the planet. In its initial formulation, therefore, the concept sought to describe a process in which human activities had altered the planet so significantly and potentially irreversibly that they had pushed the planet into a new geological epoch. The concept mobilized different fields of knowledge and public policy that sought to adapt this concept to their respective epistemological, conceptual, and analytical frameworks. So we see papers dealing with security in the Anthropocene, refugees in the Anthropocene, human settlements in the Anthropocene, international relations in the Anthropocene, and so on, including of course, the presentation I'm trying to articulate here, which is called Financing Development in the Anthropocene. Its broadening has transformed the concept into a kind of a buzzword that nevertheless retains from its original formulation a scale, planet-humanity, and the temporality, the emergency, under the backdrop of a catastrophe that is coming in the near future. This presentation here does not intend to dig into the theoretical promises or pitfalls carried by the concept of Anthropocene. On the contrary, it draws upon first a critical standpoint articulated by many scholars on the Anthropocene's spatial-temporal underpinnings, and second, upon the recent publication of the Human Development Report in 2020 by the UNDP. The report is called The Next Frontier, Human Development and the Anthropocene. These two considerations will allow the concept of Anthropocene to be tensioned and return to the world of international politics, creating an opportunity to relocate some of the intractable problems of the international development field. The concept of Anthropocene is based on the claim that there is an unproblematic unit, humanity, to whom we may ascribe responsibility for the end of the Holocene. Criticisms of the Anthropocene as a mechanism of totalization accumulated, and it is not the case of exploring them here. It is enough, though, to recall some metaphors generated by the use of the concept of Anthropocene. Some metaphors allude to Eurocene. Another metaphors allude to Androcene or Capitalocene, to name a few. These are metaphors that illuminate the erasures produced with the concept situating it in space and time. The force that transformed the planet and produced the impacts responsible for inaugurating a new geological era is underpinned by international inequalities. All of these metaphors allude to inequalities one way or another. Moreover, if we open the sovereign national state black box, we will find that these forces are built upon deep inequalities of class, race, and gender. Evidence to support this erasure is abundant. To take one example, let us consider for a moment the Human Development Report published at the end of last year. The report is an attempt to adjust the two orders of the concepts, Anthropocene and human development. Despite the initial state of this debate, some points are worth noting, actually 2 points. Firstly, the report attempts to highlight how inequalities in human development sustain and deepen the pressures on the planet. The figure here, as you can see in the shared screen, the figure here shows three groups of countries. The first group here, A, are composed by countries with low human development indexes and low material footprint or low contribution to carbon emissions. The second group here, B, is composed by countries with high human development index, and surprise, surprise, these countries are mostly responsible for or have a greater material footprint and are more responsible for carbon emissions. There is a third group of countries here, the middle income countries, in which we can find countries like Brazil. But as Mario said, most of middle income countries in Latin America are also here. And there is a position here, which the Human Development Report calls C, which is the position that we should go, move towards, which is the position of decarbonization and more equality. So this figure shows how exemplary countries, those with the highest human development index, are those with the biggest material footprint and therefore exert greatest pressure on the planet. Secondly, the document registers the limits of decoupling strategies enabled by the Anthropocene concept itself. The concept of Anthropocene creates or enables a strategy which is being called decoupling. The idea that you can decouple, you can separate economic growth and carbon emissions, either in relative terms or in absolute terms. In relative terms means that you're going to grow you're going to grow, sorry, your growth will generate less, if you reduce growth, you are going to reduce the emissions. The absolute terms means that your growth can be bigger, but the number of emissions, the quantity of emissions will be significantly lower than your growth. So what the Human Development Report does is to show that these the coupling strategies are limited, either by the circumstances, by the fact that what we are seeing now is mostly relative gains and not absolute gains in terms of emissions, and secondly, because there is a missing gap, which is inequality. So what the study suggests is that we should create a kind of a policy package, and I'm quoting the study here, a kind of a policy package on climate change mitigation would allow the world to reach net zero emissions in 2050 at moderate transitional growth and employment costs, resulting in a global net output gains up to 13% of the GDP by 2100. For that model, the problem here is that model requires income transfers for compensating the poor for the costs of energy transition, which is something that we are not discussing seriously, I guess. From my perspective, what the report does is to open the discussion about the pathways for a decarbonized future in a more equal terms. So despite its limitations, the concept of the Human Development Report tensions the concept of Anthropocene and bring it back to politics, opening up the debates on how to finance development in the Anthropocene in at least 3 dimensions. The first one is the dimension of differentiation. Even though the report does not mention the problem of differentiation of contributions, I do think that this is a problem opened or reinforced by the concept of Anthropocene. Since the Anthropocene assumes that the humanity as a whole is responsible for creating the planetary pressures that we have today, it also assigns or ascribes to the humanity the task or the responsibility to solve the problem. The question here is that as we notice, the humanity is not exactly responsible for that, but we can think about classes, we can think about countries, we can think about classes, we can think even about gender or races, which are more responsible than others to that kind of situation. So there is a call for a debate on differentiation beyond the concept of CBDR, which is precisely what we have today. So the first question that I would like to address is the issue of CBDR. Today we have 3 proposals over the table, at least 3 proposals over the table. The concept of CBDR, as it was established in 1992 in the Rio conference, the idea that developed countries should contribute for lowering the pressure over the planet. The second proposal, and the main example of that is the Kyoto Protocol. The second proposal is a proposal mostly advocated by the European Union, which is a kind of a burden sharing, which can be found in this very disturbing sentence in which most European leaders suggest that today we are all developing countries and we have all to solve the problems in the same manner. But the idea of burden sharing is that everybody has to contribute more or less equally to provide the global public goods like climate, and this is something that ignores completely not only the difference in capacities for doing so, but also the historical debt that was accumulated over centuries of colonization and so on and so forth. The burden sharing is the second proposal. So we have CBDR, we have burden sharing, and we have a third proposition, which was the proposition that won when we negotiated both the Agenda 2030 and the Paris Agreement, which is the idea of voluntary contributions. This is what the Chinese.
Paulo, sorry.
Okay. This is what the Chinese government calls CBDR 2.0. Is the idea that every country should contribute according to its capacity and according their own decision. We have another. I cannot lose the opportunity to say that we have a CBDR by Bolsonaro, which means that CBDR by Bolsonaro means. We have the forest, we have the natural resources, and if you want us to preserve it, you have to pay for it. Otherwise, we are going to destroy it, and probably we are going to destroy it anyway at the end of the day. This is the Bolsonaro version of CBDR as expressed 15 days ago. But we have another proposition that was articulated by the Brazilian government in 2012 or 2013 in the COP, in the Conference of Parties in Peru, which is the proposition of concentric differentiations. The idea of concentric differentiations is that countries should have a responsibility in providing public goods according to different levels of development, or if I can say, according to different levels of human development, which means that every country here in this particular positions in this graph should contribute according to the position. I'm running out of the time, but I just want to mention two other questions that are opened with this the debate proposed by the Human Development Report 2020. The first one is the pathways for decarbonization, and I do think that we should discuss development transition in a more serious way, because as Mario said, most of the countries which are in this intermediate position here, they are middle-income countries. They are not receiving aid anymore. They, in most cases, beyond the COVID scenario, most cases they would not need aid anymore, but they have some structural bottlenecks in terms of development that should be addressed. And a interesting pathway to think about development and to think about a universal project of development is precisely the concept of development transition. We can further elaborate that later on. And finally, a specific role of development banks. Development banks, particularly since the inception, the creation of the AIIB and the new development bank, they started to work. They started to adopt a safeguards policy based on the idea of country systems, based on the idea of the alignment of safeguards to national systems for social environmental protection. And this is definitely not satisfactory if we want to think in a more encompassing development project that would address both inequalities and the pressure, the planetary pressures. Thank you. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you, Paulo. If you could just stop sharing your screen.
Yes.
We move now to Rogerio, who's back. Thank you very much, Rogerio. It's your turn.
Thank you. I'll try to share my screen here with you. Can you hear me well? Okay. We have 15 minutes, right? Or...
Yes, 15 minutes. I let you know 3 minutes before.
Okay. Okay, this is desktop. PowerPoint. Okay, what is going on? Can you see me? Can you see my screen?
Not yet. The share screen is open now for you, I think so.
No, I can.
The button.
It is open.
I don't know what is going on here, but I cannot open it.
Do you want to send, but the scratching button is not working? Because if you want to share your...
No, I'm saying share that, and I'm wasting time of, and it's precious now. Content from second camera.
Do you want to send the presentation so we share for you?
I don't think that we have time for that. It's going to take too long.
If you're
Let me go ahead without the...
Oh, sorry, Rogerio, go ahead.
Let me go ahead without it, okay? And I'm going to use my own 15 minutes, the best way I can. First of all, I apologize for being late. And the reason I was late, it is also associated with the reason I'm here. I'm a macroeconomist, and specialized in finance, and I invented myself to be in the sustainability space, particularly because of the children that I have and thinking about future generations. And I have to say to you, and this is going to make sense in the presentation, that I'm a person in a hurry and very concerned, but I think there are ways where we can move some of the agendas pretty well. I work at WI. WI is a think tank, so that looks at the evidence of transitions to sustainable future. And I am focused on the issues of how to mobilize resources for that transition. So let me start by saying that we have a picture now, and I wish I could show you the picture, but unfortunately I have to share the PowerPoint later, that we have the legacy of this crisis. Well, the overall picture is tremendous. I mean, we know that 71 million people are pushed into extreme poverty in 2020, and this is not changing substantially as the world is recovering. Most of them are in developing countries, particularly low-income countries. 90% of students are out of school. Most of them are in developing countries. Of course, you have a K-shaped recover when some countries are recovering much faster than other ones. And certainly there are many left behind. I wish I could show you the slide, but I promise I'll share that with you. The other picture is the richer is getting richer. Labor loss income has been quite significant through this process of $3 trillion in 2020, while the richer, the billionaire, gained around almost $4 trillion through the crisis. So as the poor get poorer, I mean, you can see that where they are. But I have just a number that we all should have in mind, that the predictions now for 2021 is that we're going to have over 200 million more people after this crisis that are poorer. The debt situation that is this crisis leaving is tremendous. I mean, but emerging market economies are the ones that are growing less. The developed countries, advanced economies, are expanding their debt, have expanded the debt substantially, and not even counting the monetary financing of the measures that they put in place. What are the consequences for the world, for climate? Of course, for inequality and development, we see that the picture is very concerning. But for climate, even though we had a decline of emissions of around 70% in 2020, it is going up again, and there is no way we can achieve a trajectory that is considered within what is Paris aligned without having immediately a green recovery of all countries. But it's particularly important that for the long term that developing countries, they engage in green recoveries and transition, not only because it's best for them, but because it is going to allow or to avoid, and I'm going to be talking about this, locking in high emissions activities in sectors. So the way to go about it, I mean, not surprising, everybody's talking about infrastructure. I mean, infrastructure always came as a response to crises like this, which are structural and create effective demand problems. But as we see in the recent work by the IMF, I mean, the multipliers of investments in infrastructure are quite significant. When you include that renewable or sustainable infrastructure, the impacts become even larger because they have they also impact the quality of living and therefore the productivity of most countries. If you add to that nature-based solutions, then the gains can be quite significant because it also not only provides a transition to low carbon economy, but also provides more resilience to climate change. This is important. There's a role here of at the same time avoiding increase of emissions, but also adapting to the already existing effects of climate change. So I'm so sorry I cannot present you these numbers, but I said I'm going to share that with you. I mean, the numbers for investment opportunities, direct jobs, and reductions of CO2 are quite significant throughout the world. Interestingly, if we look at Latin America, it has the most to gain in terms of, one of the most to gains in terms of investment opportunities because of the lack of infrastructure in the region and how much that would contribute for the development of the region, but also has, but does not have direct, as significant impact on employment as other regions, but it's still 27 million jobs that could be created in a transition in 2030 to a low carbon economy. So in addition to that, there are other benefits that comes with the recovery. And you're going to see more details about that. Now, the question is, this is an opportunity for developing countries. We have not done yet as an international community work on looking on the benefits and opportunities created by a transition to low carbon economy. We do that a lot, but I think we should do that more because it's important for developing country policymakers to understand that. But one thing is understanding, of course. The other thing is looking at the possibilities of making it a doable project. So, for instance, we just in WI we did some work with in Indonesia, China, Brazil. We're doing some work, some modeling for Colombia. The numbers are quite significant. I will share them with you, but just to give an idea, in the case of Indonesia, by 2030, over 5.3 trillion added GDP, less 40,000 deaths, extreme poverty reduced by 4.2%, employment 15.3 million more, and so on. In the case of Brazil, our new report, New Economy Brazil, shows that the same picture. There's an increase of 2 million jobs by 2030, an increase of GDP of $535 billion, restoration of 12 million hectares of land, and so on. So the opportunities are all there, and I would submit to you that we need to do more of this kind of analysis in order to show what kind of opportunity developing countries are losing and the world is losing. And when I say the world is losing, it's because the fact that developing countries may not be opting for green recoveries and just transition, and well, I'll talk a little bit more about that, has enormous consequences in terms of locking in emission-intensive investments, infrastructure, and activities. For instance, I would just mention two examples that are right in my mind. Colombia in its decision to invest in coal production and coal distribution. Mexico in oil. Mexico is discussing a refinery now, when you see clearly that the production of oil in Mexico is not going to persist, but this is going to create even more carbon emission. And in Brazil, it's unsustainable agriculture. For instance, just to give one example, and the consequence of unsustainable agriculture is also, more support and more pushes towards deforestation. In terms of long-term growth and employment, clearly the impacts overall are quite significant. This is the word is integrated, and so the consequences for developing countries are also consequences for the world. The consequences in terms of stranded assets, of assets that are losing the value. And if you make an investment in a refinery, clearly you're going to, at the end of the day, end up with an asset that cannot pay for the debt that it has created, and it has consequences of financial stability. And there's a lot of financial actors and central banks looking at this issue at the moment. And of course, I mean, at the end of the day, the most important consequence for developing countries is unjust development, because climate risk will affect the poorest, and the less they are prepared for that, the worse they will be affected. So if they are such significant opportunities and such incredible risks, why is nothing's happening? So if you look at, for instance, the stimulus package, it's clearly concentrating in countries that had either the capacity to finance monetarily the expenses, or could use the fiscal space in a positive way. Let's put it. Very few countries nowadays have the privilege. So not surprising, the United States is leading in the $16 trillion rescue, followed by Japan, Germany, European Union, China, and then United Kingdom. I mean, then you go all the way down to, surprisingly, India and Brazil, and then all the developing countries almost have nothing to show in terms of the recovery efforts. So the recovery itself is difficult because it's in developing countries, it's constrained by fiscal constraints, and I'm sorry to be repetitive, but also with very shallow financial markets, which doesn't allow the governments to and the investors to use that in order to get out of the crisis.
You have 3 minutes?
I have 3 minutes, yes. So the consequences of that is up to January 2001 of approved stimulus. You have $1 trillion that are going to CO2 intensive industry, and only $939 billion that are going into, so to speak, green recoveries and just transition. And when you look at the numbers within, and I said I'm going to share the slides with you, you're going to see that developing countries, except for some countries in Asia, and particularly China, is doing the best. Now, I want to submit to you the finding that we have to think very innovatively, and we cannot reinvent the wheel. One of the issues has to do with, of course, having the capacities to plan and to implement green recoveries. It is important to say, I mean, a lot of people criticize countries like Brazil. I'm the first one to do that. The Brazilian government is doing a horrible job on so many levels, particularly on the social level, environmental level, is a disaster. But the question that we have to ask is why Brazilians have at some point voted for a government like that, because they knew what was going to happen. It's a question of hope. I mean, the developing countries, there is this greater feeling that I have observed for years that any solutions for the world economy, they're going to be left behind. So it is important to reestablish hope by, first of all, providing full understanding of credible advantages of green investments for both recovery and long-term strategy. The second is finding ways to create a space to plan and implement sustainable investment programs in developing countries. This is not easy. This is a role that, for instance, the IMF should be playing now, leading that together with the World Bank, using that space for green investment. Developing countries need to fill gaps. I mean, there are different gaps in terms of producing and preparing and scaling up aggregate investments. They have knowledge and capacity gaps that need to be filled. They need to mainstream sustainability, taxonomy, and quality investment ratings. They have to define finance needs throughout the project life cycles. They have to select and create risk management instruments, and they have to promote different types of blend financing and enhancements. And they need to be offered bridges to national and international sources of long-term and green investment. So I have 1 minute, so I want to jump to, I heard a lot about that in the previous colleagues, and particularly I was paying attention to an issue that is dear to me, and also to Stephany and other workers. It's the role of public development banks. I think Stephany has emphasized enough. I have some numbers here to add about the size of that. The problem is not so much the size of those institutions, is their capacity to cooperate in an active way in order to promote exactly those issues that I have been mentioned here. Promote climate actions in developing countries, prepare, scale up, and aggregate investment, create sustainability taxonomy, and so on, help define financing needs, produce capacity, provide risk management instruments, promote blend financing, and offer bridges to national and international green finance. I just want to submit, and I think I'm finishing now in 20 seconds, that it's not so much a question of reinventing the wheel in terms of international cooperation. It's to mandate those institutions, for instance, through the International Development Finance Corporation, with the support of the G20 and other groupings, to work in a multi-actor cooperation way in order to address these issues and accelerate dramatically green recoveries and transitions to low-carbon economy developing countries. I stop here. I apologize for not being able to share my PowerPoint, but I'll send it to you right away.
Thank you very much, Rogerio. I think we all had some technological issues, so no problem. I just emphasize again that we'll share all PowerPoints on the homepage of our network and also the co-organizers. So now we have actually some time for Q&A. And I'll propose, first of all, for everyone attending the conference, you can send your written questions to the Q&A. I cannot see yet any. But until we get some from there, I propose that we can do a round among ourselves here. I have a couple of points to raise to all panelists, and also we can just a round of questions, and then we go for each one of you to your final comments. So first of all, I think this was excellent. I mean, so many issues, and I'm really glad that in the network we'll have the chance to continue discussing that, even because our second event will be also about climate change, the one that we are hosting here in Rio, hopefully presential, but if not, again, the webinar. So just some questions stimulated by debates. I'm not addressing anyone specifically, but of course, I know that some of you dealt more with those issues. One is the question of the dependence of natural resources that we also heard yesterday in our panel yesterday. And how, I mean, if you can talk a little bit about proposals on how to deal with that, because it touches, I think, the issue of principles that Paulo said about CDBDR, but also resources and massive changes in some countries at least. I mean, and in Latin America, we know that most countries are dependent on natural resources one way or the other. So if you have proposals about that, and you could comment also on what you think about technological transfer. We talked about that yesterday, that in the vaccinations, for instance, in the case of Brazil, we are only able to produce to be delivering some now, because we did have technological transfer from two of the many options of vaccinations. So, I mean, what do you think about it? I think it's a difficult issue, and I think it's on the table for centuries, probably, technological transfer and intellectual property rights and so on. The second issue is about the development banks, and of course, definitely think the welcoming resources from development banks, but I also, as a political science, just wanted also to bring the issue of, we know that in the International Development Bank, there was a polemic about the last president or director that was appointed. It's the first one ever that's not in Latin America, but an American, still under the government of Trump. So I just want to bring this also to the table. I think in the network we'll be discussing also more political aspects of these issues and how important it is to have democratic systems for the members of these boards, but also these elections to the directors of these banks. I mean, it's extremely important. We are in a transition also, global transition, and these positions have been politicized in Latin America a lot. So to have something to say about that, how to guarantee that these appointees would be fulfilling their roles and not geopolitical, just strategical issues that in Latin America that has been the case in the past. And just one last point, then of course, relating a little bit more to Brazil and the Brazilian speakers. I mean, how to deal with Bolsonaro. We still have 1 year. He has a strong role still in the climate change, and his Ministry of Environment has been very, very fast on doing a lot of all those desired measures. So how to engage civil society, how to engage, I think Stephany also mentioned that, the role of NGOs to make pressure on the investments and make those information transparent also. I hope that we'll be able to bring all these issues also in the coming events, but if you can comment on that. But maybe before we can just also add other questions from the table, you can raise your hands and then we can do a round of the speakers. Someone want to add some more questions now? Christian, Stefan, those who didn't speak yet now. Otherwise, we can do a... Oh.
Okay, I could make just a short question if you want. Could I ask one question?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I'm absolutely not an expert in development financing, but do the experts think that it would be possible to closer link financing to the planning and carrying out of concrete projects? For example, the strategy of China in Africa is exactly that they offer very concrete packages. So if something in infrastructure, a new railway or a power station whatsoever should be constructed, then they offer the complete project, so to speak, planning, financing, and to a large extent also carrying out. And I remember that, for example, the Marshall Plan was to some extent also organized along similar lines. So it was not that the United States gave financial means to European countries, but they provided European countries with capital goods, with trains, turbines, whatsoever. Then the recipient countries sold those capital goods, and the means of financing then constituted the basis of the so-called European Recovery Fund. So my question would be, shouldn't the concrete, the financing issue linked closer to the concrete project issue, in particular as regards, of course, the problem of investments in the reduction of carbon emissions?
I think we had Rogerio Studart first, and then, but maybe we privileged those who didn't speak yet, Rogerio. So please, Bernard, fine.
Yes, I have a question for Stephany, but also for the other thinkers, the other participants. Sorry. As you know, the G20 has given the green light to a new allocation of SDR, equivalent to 500 billion SDR. Only a very small portion of those SDRs will actually go in the pocket, I would say, of emerging market countries or low-income countries. And we should encourage perhaps the industrialized countries, the advanced countries who have surely enough central bank reserves to put those funds at the disposal, first of all, of a regional mechanism of monetary cooperation. I think you have one in Latin America. I'm thinking of the Chiang Mai safety net in Asia, or the project of an African monetary fund. But then the next point, I mean, Stephany said that we should beef up the capital bases of the multilateral development bank. Of course, you will tell me this is monetary resources. You cannot use them for the capital, but perhaps we should there also think a little bit out of the box and wonder if that would not be also feasible. First of all, to enhance the means of the IMF, the general agreement to borrow, but perhaps also help in the replenishment of the International Development Association. And why not, after all, enhance the capital bases of the classical multilateral development banks, including the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. So what are your views on that? Thank you.
May I add one question about exactly that, Andrea?
Okay, and then we have Rogerio.
Because I think Rogerio can also answer the question I'm raising here. It's precisely about the question that Bernard just raised. And I would add, there is a problem with private debt as well. Actually, two blind spots, I think, Stephany, Mario, and Rogerio, perhaps two blind spots in the entire system. One is private debt. A large amount of debt, particularly in middle-income countries, is actually private debt, and private debt is not joining the initiative of rolling out the debt or the service of the debt. As in public banks. And the other question is the lack of a specific package or specific actions for middle-income countries. There is all the debate about the pardon of the debt for low-income countries, but there is nothing regarding middle-income countries, which are the countries that are suffering the most, I guess, particularly because of the larger populations are in these countries. And finally, how about the rating agencies? Because we are talking about expanding the fiscal space, but the rating agencies they are not working the same pace on the same book. So how about that? So it's kind of a messy situation.
Thank you. We have Rogerio and then Mario, please.
Mario, why don't you go ahead first, please?
You prefer? I would like to start from one point that was raised by Stefan, I think very correctly. But I would like to introduce a dimension that I think risks to be set aside in the debate on financing that, however, under my point of view, remain crucial. Let me go back to the reference of Stefan. Stefan spoke about the Marshall Fund. Now, the Marshall Fund was actually administrated in a very original and innovative way that, under my point of view, represent a first start in the multilateral arena. there was not the creation of a specific institution and function with bureaucrats. Rather, they were networks of bureaucrats that came from the different countries, European, only European, that discussed among themselves what were the priorities and try to understand each other in repeated meetings that created trust in order to then decide what to do with the money. Once this structure was over, it was decided to continue because the method was considered to be very fruitful. And then the OECD was created in '61. Now, at the same time, today, 60 years ago, John Fitzgerald Kennedy proposed the creation of the Development Center because there were only European and Canada and United States. In other terms, the rich countries, so you need to do something else. Why I'm insisting on this point? What are these people doing in those committees? They are not just defining financial strategies. They are discussing about what are the priorities, where are the assets that needs to be recreated in order for Europe to start up again. In other terms, they are discussing, maybe not with the same words, what Rogerio was saying concerning the multiplicator of the different investment. How can we use this investment to boost the European takeoff? Now, when we discuss, and here I come to the specific debate that was done before, when we discuss about Africa, where do we stand today? You know, now there is this proposal to use the SDR, and in reality, they go to the rich countries, so why don't we ask the developing country, as you said, no? To the developed country to send back some of this money in Africa. Bernard was very explicit on this. But once they are there, once we are capable, if we are capable, to create a fund there, then the point becomes, it's not enough, therefore we will have to ask to use this money to attract private funds so that we will create the volume. To do what? And here we are again to the same point. Where are we going to invest those money? Adding, moreover, those that come from China, from Turkey, from United States, 60 billion already planned, and so European Union, and so on. How do we decide? Now, in Africa, there is a process that is called the PIDA process, where they are trying to define indicators to prioritize the investment. At the same time, there is a meeting of presidents of countries in the African Union to decide themselves how to do it. In one way or the other, I think we will have to solve a major issue. This type of decision must involve, as Stephany said, the development bank. But it's not enough, because we have also to define a narrative, and banks obviously are crucial to decide financial allocation. But we need a shared narrative between the different actors so that we know that we agree on the Marshall Fund as it was spent. That was the major advantage of the Marshall Fund allocation. Now, I have two very quick points that goes back to the same conclusion. We all know that the strategy to develop and to protect environment and mitigate with environment in Botswana is going to be largely different than in Morocco, or if you prefer, in Chile, in respect to Brazil. They are obviously different countries with different characteristics. Now, we have to reconcile the idea of a general collective efforts with the specific need of a specific national development strategy. Who can do that? Of course, the bank can do a lot. Are they enough? I have the feeling that is not the case. CELAC, if we speak about Latin America, will not be enough again because it's not clear what it's doing. Maybe the African Union a little bit more. ASEAN, I don't know. However, we also need a place where the different national strategy will be compared, discussed, not to define standards that will be common for the whole region. I don't think we have to go to the model of the European Pact that is also in crisis now. If you have seen Bachelard and the proposal that he made about the financial pact, there are proposals for changes. But at least we will need a table where the different presidents and the different institutions will discuss. Last but not least, as an example, we have seen it happening with taxes. We know that fiscal reform, not now, but at a certain point will be desperately required. How do we have progressed in the past with fiscal reform? By creating a forum where there are 120 countries, forum where different countries sit at the table to discuss what to do and to create a peer pressure. Sorry to be long, but I wanted to make 3 examples to simply say, all my example goes back to the need for tables, for the need of multilateralism. But what today we are lacking is inclusive tables that are representative enough. This doesn't apply to many developing banks, and even if we have developing banks active in this field, we will also need a political level. Is the G20 the level? I doubt. I doubt because it's not fully representative at present, but something of this nature will have to be created. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Rogerio was next. And then Christian.
I have to unmute. Christian, you want to go first? Okay.
Please do.
No, I'm glad that I'm last because, for instance, I don't have to repeat things that I agree completely with what Mario said, and it's going to save a lot of my issue. But let me address some of the issues that were interrelated, raised by Stefan, Bernard, and Paulo. Stefan, the issue is not so much that we have to repeat the development finance that we have nowadays. Nowadays we have a major problem, which is development finance is insufficient. I wish I could share, I'm going to share the numbers with you. You're going to see that for what is needed for climate actions at country level in developing countries alone. I mean, the multilaterals cannot do it. The $100 billion, it's just a drop in the ocean. And the other problem that you have currently with climate finance is that it is project oriented. So you have a single project that you finance and you spend a lot. I represented Brazil and other countries in the World Bank. I saw this all over again, over again, where you spend 2 or 3 years discussing one project for $50 million, $100 million when it's a big one. We don't have that time. We need to scale. We need to have the capacity to plan, to develop pipelines of projects, and to implement them, and then to mobilize resources. I submit to you that we have, Stefan, that we have to stop thinking about climate finance. We should stop thinking about green resources mobilization, okay? This requires 2 things. First, government capacities and private sector capacities to develop a vision, a plan, and projects. And that requires initial investments. And then that requires using good projects to mobilize resources that are needed from the private sector, for specialized institutional investors and so on. And this is growing tremendously. If you look at the green finance sphere worldwide, is increasing in the numbers of trillions of dollars, but it's basically captured by those countries in Europe, Asia, and North America that have the capacity to develop good pipelines of projects. So I would submit that you need to create a space so the countries can be able to plan and to develop projects for green recoveries. The second thing, and that was, for instance, the discussion of fiscal space and also mobilization of resources come together. This is why I talk about national development banks and public development banks, not because they can solve the problem, but by collectively being part of a network of institutions that share what Mario called a common narrative, and that can provide that linkage between developing countries, planning capacity, and mobilizing resources nationally, internationally, then you can get the trillions that you need. And the beauty about this is that doesn't require reinventing the wheel. I mean, Stephany and I and others have been showing that public development banks are there. They're doing a good job in terms of greening an investment. It requires just having the mindset, the political will, and the coordination effort, thinking differently about what we do nowadays. And I think it can be done. It can be done very quickly. But I'll stop here because I get excited. I can talk about this for another half hour.
Thank you, Rogerio. I think we have Christian now and then Stephany.
Thanks, Andrea. Well, just a few remarks. First of all, everything would be simpler if we would be able to decide for a steady rising path for all the CO2 production or all the fossil energy. As we already discussed, and it is in the development that Stefan made in the book, it is the question is to channel the resources where it will be profitable. If we don't change the relative prices of fossil energy, forget about to try to select priorities. This would be totally a concept of different view, different priorities, vested interests, and so on. Only the price could do the job. So my following point is, why are we unable at the multilateral or national or regional level, unable to do that? In the 50s, the US government was already totally aware. It was President Eisenhower. He mentioned to President Kennedy that the most dangerous threat for the US economy and welfare was the global warming. Why, since 1958, we are still discussing exactly the same? So vested interests did a lot of investment for disinforming. And we had recently, up to last year, a big example in the US about this disinformation. But we need to make people aware at all levels. And there, what Mario was reminding about the Marshall Plan, the method was just a method of dialogue among not politicians, not ambassadors. They are useless, just technicians, economists. And to do that at regional level first, in order to make coalition, a big coalition between Latin America with the Caribbean, European Union and Africa, then China and India could jump into this, and very quickly we could agree upon this change in relative price. And that's all. The rest will be automatic because markets are dynamic once we don't have uncertainty. So this is my position. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. I think we had Stephany next.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just on Christian, I'm glad he has so much faith in economists. I think it's nice to hear. I wanted, Stefan asked about the Marshall Plan. Very briefly, I wanted to say something which is quite interesting, that it was money from the Americans, from the Marshall Plan, that created the German Development Bank, which has actually been so central to German development. We're actually making a case that why did the Americans create a development bank in Germany and didn't create one at home, which is an interesting question, maybe to do with vested interest. I wanted, though, to focus on the questions that Bernard asked, very interestingly, how the SDR could be used. I understand there's a big fight about this. I think the IMF would like to channel it, through the PRGF, this facility which they have to lend to low-income countries and where they can have a certain degree of conditionality, and they've used it before. But I think much more creative are the ideas that you have been presenting, Bernard, like I think it's an excellent idea to channel it through regional monetary mechanisms like the FLAR in Latin America and the Chiang Mai in Asia. Although, as far as I know, the Chiang Mai initiative has never been used. So I don't know what effect it would have. But I think the idea of using it to capitalize development banks is absolutely excellent. And it could be capitalized specifically for example, green and just transition. So it could have an increase in capital, and the lending that would be facilitated should go to green and inclusive transformation. And I think this, although, you know, it's more a monetary instrument and really should have a fiscal transfer, but I think the world could be flexible in these times of massive QE being used for long-term investment. So I think that would be an excellent idea. On the coordination of development banks, I think Rogerio has an excellent point. There are institutions, for example, the IDFC and the AFD last year ran a big summit, the first summit of development banks, national, regional, and multilateral. And they are trying hard, particularly on this issue of green finance, to coordinate. And hopefully there's a lot of work going on among economists at these banks and academics, so maybe that will help. But I think it's important also to have political support. Now, I would like to address finally, if I may, 2 points that Paulo made, which are very dear to my heart, because I'm working on them. One is the issue of private debt, including that of middle-income countries. And I'm involved in a project on, we're presenting ideas on having a mechanism for debt conversion for green and inclusive recovery. So you would have like a mega swap. You would give debt relief to countries, and instead of, say, telling them to implement austerity or privatize things as has been done in the past, say in the Brady restructuring, you could say you have to channel these additional monies to programs, not just projects, but programs, as Stefan rightly says, that will lead to more green and inclusive recovery. And so I think this would be maybe politically attractive to developed countries, because maybe they would give more debt relief if they see it being channeled in this positive way, and it would be good for developing countries. And we see that this should be not just for low-income countries, even though they do need debt relief, but there are a lot of countries, for example, in the Caribbean, that have been very badly hit by climate change and that are middle income, but they need debt relief. I think to convince the developed countries to give debt relief to the Brazils of the world, I would love them to do it, but to be frank, I think it's going to be tough. Just one last point on China. China is a member, it's not a member of the Paris Club, but it has coordinated for this common framework. But China, yes, it lends for lovely projects, not always cheaply, not always well implemented, but it does do a good project. But to pay itself, it tells the country, you can't, you know, when you export the product that you will export via the port that we build you, the money will not go into your central bank account. It will go to an escrow account to pay us. So the Chinese debt is actually, at least in Africa, extremely rigid, very difficult to restructure, and very difficult for the country to say, look, I'm not going to pay you this year because I can't, because of COVID, or because my commodity price has collapsed. So there is a problem about Chinese debt, which is quite serious because it's quite a high proportion of the debt. But it is true that a lot of the money has gone into concrete, valuable projects, whereas the World Bank goes in and talks about governance or vague things. And finally, sorry to be so long, rating agencies. I think I've just written a paper for the UN on that. I'm very happy to share it, Paulo. I think rating agencies are actually playing quite a sinister role. They are regulated after the global financial crisis, but very lightly. They're basically regulated by regulators from the developed countries, and developing ones don't have much voice. they tend to downgrade more the poorer countries. They had pressure not to downgrade the developed countries now in the COVID crisis. And they have all sorts of conflicts of interest because they actually advise countries how they should produce instruments so they can get a good rating, as they did in the subprime, in the ratings that led to the subprime crisis. So I think the rating agencies, A, should be regulated properly with voice from developing and emerging countries, and B, there is the idea, which I think is interesting in the UN in particular, that you should have public rating agencies. They should be competitive because it's an oligopoly of three, basically, all based in the US, which have a very strong power. They make an incredible amount of profit. The rate of profit is 60%. So if they have transactions for 100 million, they keep 60 million for themselves. So they have a very strong vested interest to do things in ways that favor them, but not in ways that help developing countries get out of crisis. And I think that maybe the main problem is that they're very pro-cyclical, because in good times, they're trying to get as many people to get rated, and so they give them all very nice ratings. As soon as a crisis hits, the rating agency will downgrade the countries, particularly developing ones, and that will deepen the crisis. So they should do it much more counter-cyclically. I will stop, sorry.
Please send us your paper, Stephany. Fundamental, this paper.
Thank you.
Please.
But I think Rogerio has raised hand.
Yeah, I just want to reinforce what Stephany has just said. I think it's a great idea. What you need, as I said, I think Mario said that quite well. First of all, you have to have a clear narrative to bring on board, for instance, a president, a governor, or mayor, any developing country. If you ask her, well, are you going to do a green recovery or a transition? You're going to say, well, this is a great idea if you show me the numbers. WI has been producing the numbers to show that it is a good idea. It's good economics. But the other thing is to say, can we do it? When you say, can you do it, is finance and investment. That's why you have to have a discussion. And you have to allow countries to have the space to plan, to create that, develop the narrative jointly with other partners, plan green recovery and transition, and then implement that. You have to give assurance to her, I mean the policymaker, that this is not only a good idea, it is doable. And the perception in many countries, in developing countries, is that that narrative is not there. Even those, I've been doing this work in engaging with developing countries very often. When you have that conversation, the first thing they're going to say, well, this is beautiful, but how can we do it? What is the finance coming? And when we talk about finance, it's not just climate finance, because they know it comes in drops. It's how you mobilize resources to do that. And that's what I think Stephany's idea of capitalizing development banks. It's great, as long as that comes with a plan and integrated with all the development banks in order to accelerate project development, pipeline creation, and so on. On the ratings, Stephany, I have to say I'm much more optimistic nowadays for the wrong reasons, for the bad reasons. Why? Because climate risk is being mainstream in financial decision making. It's a discussion of the central banks. It's a discussion of institutional investors that comes every day out there. And it is a discussion that is coming to the rating nations too, because they know they cannot rate anybody without taking climate risk, because they know the impacts of stranded assets in portfolios. So this is creating a good moment in terms of going towards financing green recoveries and transition. You have to accelerate that with regulation. But I think that for the first time in many years, rating institutions and investors can be pro-cyclical rather than counter-cyclical. I'll stop here because I know Stephany has more to say about that. I never disagree with her, but this is one point I must disagree today.
Okay. Stephany, you have to open your microphone.
Sorry. I think, Rogerio, maybe you're talking too much to the private sector. But the rating agents, and I just written this paper with somebody who used to work for Standard & Poor, they do not take enough account of climate risk because they tend to be quite short-termist. And what we were suggesting, maybe you should have some kind of arm's length foundation, which would look perhaps at long-term risks like climate change in particular, because I don't think they do a good job on that. I think some private investors are talking a lot about taking account of climate risk, and some are when it affects their interests. But there's also a lot of greenwashing. I think we have to be very careful and very rigorous in measuring, whether really, for example, green bonds are actually, the money is being used to fund genuinely green climate, green activities. So I think tight regulation, tight monitoring is really important, because everybody, of course, loves green transition now. It's even a sort of commercially nice thing to say, but the question is, are they doing it? I heard a presentation from BlackRock, and the people who were talking were actually excellent, but it was a small proportion of their assets. I think you have to always look at the total level of their assets. I think there are encouraging elements, but you have to be very careful. We know.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. So no, I'm seeing we have about 10 minutes to go, and I see Paulo has his hand raised. So I propose that we do a last round of brief final comments by the speakers, but I also add one point, one element, because well, we are now following Tesla and Elon Musk and the digital currency discussion. And Stephany already proposed even that for our series of more kind of individual webinars, we can discuss that. But I just wanted to introduce that because that has been also discussed, the role of digital currencies. But maybe it's too much for this final round. Again, I think we organize a single event, webinar about that. And then on top of the speakers who can just have a final word, if Stephany can also say something about that. Thank you. So we could actually start with, well, Paulo has a raised hand, but then we could start with Stephany and the table in the order of presentations, if that's fine. And if Christian, of course, wants to add something else. So Paulo and then Stephany.
Oh, sorry, sorry, Andrea. I was confused. It's just a final skeptical remark. I'm always the pessimistic. One reason for concern for me, and one reason to reinforce Mario's idea that we do need some kind of a table with more open positions for non-governmental agents is the fact that when we look, we are conducting a research on Amazon countries, on social environmental protection in Amazon country, in 5 countries in the Amazon. And what we are seeing is that it is, you can see a coeval process. I cannot claim that there is a causal nexus between these two things. But one thing that we can see is development banks, public development banks, including the World Bank, started to try to align their own safeguards policies with country systems, with national systems of social environmental protection. This is something that the World Bank piloted during the 2000s, and finally in 2016, if I'm not mistaken, the World Bank adopted this as a policy. In the same year that the New Development Bank and the AIIB launched their own policies, and these policies focus on country systems. At the same time, we saw a second wave of deregulation in Amazon countries. We had the first wave of the regulation during the 2000s in all Amazon countries, but Brazil was outside of this trend. But after the 2010, Brazil started to deregulate its own process and legislation for social environmental protection. And we are seeing that all across the region. So it's not a matter of having one government or another. It's a trend that we can see in all these countries. So I'm quite skeptical that we are actually following the same path. And when you look at the country level, what you see is a process in which you have first, what they call licensing express, or a process of speeding up the process of the environmental licensing, the opening of protected areas for mining, for the mining industry, the opening of protected areas for agriculture, and so on and so forth in the entire region. And one thing that we can think about, and this is a reason, this is my reason for concern. One of the products that is being extracted in most of these countries, sorry, not in most, at least in one country is Bolivia, but you can also find in another South American countries like Chile or Argentina, is actually lithium to sustain the power, the energy transition in the north. So either we take this as a broader compact where all these interests are in the same table and adopting the same narrative and the same pathway, or we are going to fail badly. Thank you, Andrea.
Okay. Thank you, Paulo. I think I'm really happy that we'll have lots of occasions to continue discussion on all of these, because we were asked to be very punctual. Some of us have commitments straight after. So I really just then continue with the backwards, then last words of our panelists. So Paulo already said something, so it's Rogerio could now say something, and then Stephany and Mario Pezzini. Thank you. Microphone.
I just want to make a very quick comment about what Paulo said. I agree there are reasons to be skeptical, but there's no time to be skeptical. And I think that as we don't have time, and on the other hand, as an economist, well, yeah, so as a political economist, I can say to you, there are no macroeconomic, technical, or finance constraint to do the deal. And we have the obligation, to keep saying that very loud, to see you do not have to reinvent the wheel in terms of macroeconomic instruments, in terms of technical technology available, knowledge available, and finance. It is a question of political will, and we can deliver that. We can. That's what I'll keep doing as loud as I can for the rest of my life, I guess. I'll stop here.
Thank you. So Stephany, for a few last words. Microphone as well.
I really agree with Rogerio now that we have the instruments, we have the means, we have the resources. I mean, we have these massive savings in institutional investors, and it's just a question of channeling it to the right activities. I think we are also hopeful because Biden is president and not Trump. And so there are a number of positive elements that you know we can think about how we do. I think international coordination of the kind that Mario talks about is absolutely crucial, but of course very difficult, very, very difficult. And you asked a question about why the Inter-American Development Bank was in a bit of a mess politically. I mean, I must comment that I don't know too much about it, but it seems to me that the Latin American governments could have stopped the Trump administration. They didn't coordinate among themselves. Several of them, I think including Brazil, supported the election of this American who doesn't now even get on with the Biden administration. So I think it's also a question of how the region can hopefully do better. But I think it's good to finish on a positive note that we can do it. We just need the vision and the mechanisms to channel sufficient finance to the resources. I mean, you know, Roosevelt did it, and it's been done before many other times. I think Latin America in the 50s and 60s and Europe in that period, you know, funded massive development and very successful one. So if it's done in the past, why not do it now for something even more important?
Thank you, Stephany. So please, Mario Pezzini, if you can have your last word.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. A general consideration. This was for me the first time to be around your table, and I enjoy a lot. And I found it extremely, I am happy. And I like to be with Stephany, with all these friends, Bernard, Christian, Rogerio, Paulo, you, Andrea. So it's a real pleasure to be here. If you can do it some other times, be happy to be here again and to discuss. Also, because around the table, there are so knowledgeable people about finance on which I am deeply ignorant that I am relieved so I can speak about other things. And the other things that I think are crucial in this discussion are the fact that we have to link the financing issue with the issue of asset building and what we want to do. The two pieces of the discourse needs to get together. And I don't know how, but this building of narrative between spending and resources require different actors to get together. So I'm very happy that at least you put together my ignorance with your knowledge on financing. Thank you very much. It was great.
Thank you very, very much. I think we were all the taste that we can continue that. So we will, I mean, as we mentioned yesterday and today, I think our network is just starting. I mean, with the middle of COVID, but I think we'll definitely profit also for the webinars, even later when we can do also presential, the hybrid meetings. We'll be announcing in the homepage. Our next event will also focus on climate change, so definitely all invited. But we also run some more kind of shorter individual webinars, as I said. Then Stefan already proposed this one about digital currency. So I hope we all keep in touch. I thank you very, very much. I learned a lot. And I think, again, this interdisciplinary approach, I think is very fruitful, hopefully, for all of us. So thank you. Have a nice afternoon, morning for all of you. I don't know if Christian wants to say also a last word, and our co-organizers from Robert Tripping Foundation. Christian, you have the last word here today.
No, just to thank all the panelists and especially our co-organizer from Torino and from Brussels and Louvain with the Robert Triffin Foundation. So thanks to all of you. And as you see, there are a lot of job to do because we are already too late. We are facing a collective suicide. And as Rogerio said, we have no more excuse. We should kill the vested interest. This is very urgent. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Valentina. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Have a great day. Hope to see you again soon.
Yes, let us keep in touch.
Thank you all.
And Andrea
Thank you.
for sharing, organizing.
And
Thanks,
tomorrow
Andrea.
recordings will be available in our websites.